Hey guys, tonight we stumble half asleep into the exhausting world of medieval labor, where every job seems specifically designed to ruin your knees, your spine, and possibly your will to live. You stand in a cold, muddy village long before sunrise, surrounded by smoke drifting from crooked chimneys, while tired workers already drag themselves toward another impossible day. There are no weekends here, no vacation requests, no motivational coffee mugs reminding you to hang in there, just endless work, suspicious soup, and the constant understanding that if you stop moving for too long, everybody suddenly becomes very concerned about whether you plan on starving dramatically in public. Honestly, you probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in tonight, comment your location and local time. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 1. Mud Before Sunrise. You begin brutal medieval labor before dawn even arrives. You wake before the sun, not peacefully, unfortunately. A rooster somewhere outside your tiny home screams into the darkness with the emotional intensity of a man warning society about the apocalypse. Cold air slips through gaps in the wooden walls, while damp straw pokes through the thin blanket beneath you. For one brief, hopeful moment, you forget where you are. Then your back reminds you. Every muscle aches before the workday even begins. This is normal. In medieval villages, physical exhaustion is not an occasional inconvenience. It is the permanent background music of existence. Your hands stay rough, your shoulders stay sore. Your feet constantly feel one bad decision away from complete collapse, and the day has not even started yet. You sit up slowly while faint orange light flickers from the dying embers of last night's fire. Nearby, someone already moves around the room preparing food, usually porridge, always disappointment. Breakfast in medieval life rarely inspires emotional excitement. A bowl of oats, stale bread, weak ale, maybe a few onions, if fortune smiles briefly upon humanity. A quirky historical detail many people forget is that medieval workers often drank weak alcohol throughout the day because water quality could be unreliable in crowded settlements. Imagine explaining to modern fitness culture that your hydration plan involves mildly alcoholic sadness soup. Outside, the village slowly wakes beneath gray pre-dawn fog. You step into mud immediately. This also becomes normal. Animals wander freely between homes, while smoke rises from low stone chimneys into the freezing morning air. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith has already begun hammering metal with the calm determination of someone personally offended by silence. The sound echoes across the village. Clang, clang, clang. You suspect medieval people collectively suffered from permanent headaches. A mainstream historical fact, often overlooked, is how physically demanding nearly all pre-modern labor truly was. Before engines, electricity, and industrial machinery, human survival depended almost entirely on muscle power. Farming, construction, transport, cooking, washing, mining. Everything required relentless physical effort from sunrise until darkness, and sometimes, beyond darkness, you join a line of workers moving slowly toward the fields outside the village. Nobody talks much this early, mostly because everyone is still emotionally negotiating with consciousness itself. The road leading outward feels cold beneath worn shoes. Frost clings lightly to patches of grass beside the path, while distant crows circle above empty farmland. Ahead, oxen pull crude wooden plows through damp earth with the exhausted energy of creatures that fully understand they were not consulted about any of this. You honestly relate to them. The fields stretch endlessly beneath the pale morning sky. That is another hidden horror of medieval labor. Repetition. Every day looks almost identical. Same soil, same weather, same aching shoulders. Modern people often imagine medieval life as dramatic battles, royal feasts, and mysterious castles glowing beneath moonlight. In reality, most people spend their lives doing the same exhausting tasks repeatedly until old age or disease interrupts the schedule. Usually rudely, you grip a wooden farming tool while cold wind pushes against your cloak. Nearby workers begin clearing stones from muddy soil before planting can begin properly. The work sounds simple. It is not simple. Within an hour, your hands hurt. Within 2 hours, your lower back begins quietly threatening rebellion. By midday, your entire body feels personally betrayed by civilization, and still the work continues. Scholars still argue whether medieval peasants actually worked more annual hours than modern humans because labor varied heavily by season, region, and social status. Some historians suggest agricultural workers experienced occasional periods of rest during winter months or religious festivals, while others emphasize the crushing intensity of planting and harvest seasons where survival depended entirely on constant labor. Standing here in freezing mud, however, philosophical nuance feels less important than the fact your fingers have stopped cooperating with basic human expectations. Around noon, workers gather briefly beside the field for food. You lower yourself carefully onto a tree stump while someone passes around rough bread hard enough to qualify as defensive weaponry. Cheese appears briefly, so does silence. Everybody eats like exhausted survivors after a natural disaster. A strange detail historians sometimes mention is that medieval laborers consumed enormous amounts of calories compared to many modern office workers. Physical jobs demanded constant energy, especially during harvest seasons. Bread alone formed a massive portion of daily nutrition because workers burned through food frighteningly fast. Honestly, after several hours in this field, you would probably eat a decorative candle if somebody served it confidently enough. The afternoon somehow feels longer than the morning. The sun climbs weakly overhead while mud thickens around your boots. One worker coughs continuously nearby, another wraps cloth around bleeding fingers before quietly returning to work because apparently medieval healthcare mostly operates on optimism and denial. You notice something unsettling. Nobody complains very much, not because conditions are acceptable, because suffering is expected. That psychological reality feels stranger than the labor itself. Medieval workers grow up understanding exhaustion as an unavoidable part of life. There is no fantasy of work-life balance, no inspirational productivity podcast promising better mornings through positive thinking and expensive smoothies. Only survival, and survival demands labor. As evening slowly approaches, cold shadows stretch across the fields, while workers finally begin gathering tools. Your entire body feels heavy now. Even lifting your arms requires negotiation, yet the village ahead offers little comfort. Tomorrow will repeat everything again. The same mud, the same aching muscles, the same rooster announcing misery before sunrise. Like nature's least appreciated employee, you walk slowly back toward the village beneath fading orange light while smoke drifts lazily across rooftops. Somewhere ahead, thin stew waits beside weak firelight. And honestly, that sounds incredible right now. Chapter 2. Fields that never end. Peasant farming destroys your back, hands, and patience daily. Morning arrives again with the emotional sensitivity of a falling brick. You wake before sunrise because medieval work schedules operate according to the ancient scientific principle of, if light exists, somebody should probably be suffering in a field. Outside your tiny hut, fog drifts low across the muddy village, while cold wind rattles loose wooden shutters, hard enough to suggest the weather personally dislikes you. Your back still hurts from yesterday. Actually, everything still hurts from yesterday. That becomes one of the hidden psychological tricks of medieval labor. The exhaustion never fully resets. Modern people often imagine sleep as recovery. Medieval workers mostly experience sleep as a brief intermission between different forms of discomfort. Beside the dying embers of last night's fire, somebody hands you breakfast in a cracked wooden bowl. Thin oat porridge stares back at you with the emotional energy of wet plaster. Nearby sits a piece of bread so hard, it could probably stop minor military attacks. Still, you eat immediately. Physical labor teaches the body to stop asking philosophical questions about food quality. Outside, the village slowly fills with noise. Chickens flap wildly through puddles. A dog barks at absolutely nothing with impressive confidence. Somewhere down the muddy road, iron rings sharply against iron as the blacksmith resumes his daily battle against silence itself. Clang, clang, clang. You suspect medieval villages collectively sounded like construction sites, built entirely by exhausted people who had never once experienced noise regulations. A mainstream historical fact many people underestimate is how specialized medieval labor could become even inside small villages. People often imagine peasants simply farming, but medieval communities depended on blacksmiths, millers, coopers, tanners, bakers, carpenters, shepherds, brewers, and countless other physically demanding trades. Every object in daily life required somebody's hands, tools, sweat, and spine, and many of those spines are probably in terrible condition. Today, your work takes you away from the fields and toward the village mill beside a shallow river outside town. A narrow dirt road winds between damp grass and frost-covered fences while workers trudge silently beside you carrying sacks of grain over their shoulders. Nobody talks much, partly because it is early, mostly because carrying heavy grain already consumes all available emotional energy. Ahead, the watermill slowly appears. Through pale morning fog, the wooden structure creaks beside the river like an elderly animal reluctantly agreeing to continue existing for one more day. Water crashes beneath the great turning wheel while flour dust drifts faintly from open windows above. The smell hits you immediately. Wet wood, river mud, old grain, human sweat, and underneath everything else, the deeply aggressive scent of damp flour sticking to basically every surface imaginable. You step inside. The noise becomes overwhelming instantly. Grinding stone echoes through the mill non-stop, while wooden gears groan overhead with sounds suggesting the building may collapse out of pure exhaustion. Workers haul grain sacks across dusty floors, while the miller shouts instructions nobody can fully hear over the machinery anyway. Ancient workplaces were not calm environments. Before modern safety standards, industrial noise reduction, or proper ventilation, many jobs exposed workers to constant physical strain, dangerous dust, heavy lifting, and repetitive injuries. Medieval labor was not only exhausting, it was chaotic. You help drag a grain sack toward the grinding stones. It feels impossibly heavy. That is another strange reality of medieval work. Almost everything weighs more than you expect. Water buckets, firewood, grain sacks, wet clothing, wooden tools. Human survival itself appears strangely committed to unnecessary lifting. Nearby, a worker coughs repeatedly into his sleeve while flour coats his beard completely white. Another wipes sweat from his forehead only to immediately become dusty again moments later. A quirky historical detail historians sometimes mention is how millers developed suspicious reputations throughout medieval Europe. Many villagers believed millers secretly stole grain during processing or manipulated measurements unfairly. Entire folktales emerged portraying millers as sneaky opportunists, quietly profiting from everybody else's survival. Standing here now, however, the miller mostly looks tired enough to accidentally fall directly into his own machinery. The grinding stones continue turning endlessly, hour after hour. You begin carrying smaller sacks now, but your shoulders still burn from effort. Flour sticks to your boots, while dust fills the air thick enough to make sunlight itself appear exhausted. Outside, cold rain begins falling lightly over the river. Wonderful. Workers rush briefly to cover grain supplies with rough cloth, while muddy footprints spread across the mill floor. Water drips steadily from ceiling beams into wooden buckets, placed carefully beneath leaks that clearly existed long before your arrival. Nobody even reacts anymore. Medieval buildings often contained permanent problems everybody simply accepted emotionally. Leaking roof? Normal. Rotting wood? Unfortunate but manageable. Possible structural collapse? Probably fine. Scholars still argue whether medieval peasants actually viewed physical hardship differently than modern people, or whether humans simply adapt psychologically to whatever conditions surround them most consistently. Some historians believe religious worldviews helped medieval workers endure suffering by framing hardship as spiritually meaningful. Others argue survival simply left little time for philosophical complaints. At the moment, your philosophy mostly centers around sitting down before your legs detach completely. Around midday, workers finally pause beside the riverbank for food. You lower yourself carefully onto a damp log while someone passes around bread, onions, and weak ale stored inside a dented wooden barrel. The rain has slowed into mist now. Across the river, bare trees sway gently beneath gray skies, while the mill wheel continues turning behind you with endless mechanical determination. Nobody speaks much during meals. Eating functions less like leisure and more like emergency maintenance for exhausted humans. One older worker quietly removes his boots beside the river. This proves deeply upsetting. His feet look catastrophic. Blisters, swelling, toenails that appear spiritually defeated. Honestly, medieval laborers probably deserve statues made entirely from pain medication. Another strange historical reality is how quickly the body aged under constant physical work. Many medieval laborers likely developed chronic pain, joint damage, dental problems, and physical disabilities far earlier than modern people working less demanding jobs, and there are still hours left before sunset. Rain returns harder during the afternoon. The mill grows darker beneath thick clouds while workers continue hauling grain despite increasingly slippery floors. One sack splits open suddenly, spilling grain everywhere like tiny bouncing insults across wet wood planks. Nobody panics. Everybody just sighs, then starts cleaning. Because medieval work teaches perhaps the most important survival skill in human history, everything becomes somebody's problem, eventually. By evening, your hands ache so badly, even gripping simple objects feels difficult. Flour coats your clothing completely now. Mud clings to your boots. Your shoulders burn each time you move. And still the village road stretches ahead, waiting for the walk home. You step back outside beneath freezing drizzle while smoke rises faintly from distant cottages. The muddy path glows dimly beneath fading orange light. Nearby workers trudge silently beside you carrying tools, empty sacks, and expressions suggesting civilization itself may have been a collective mistake. The blacksmith still hammers somewhere inside the village. Clang, clang, clang. Somehow, he is still going. Honestly, that feels slightly threatening. You walk slowly toward the warmth of weak firelight and another bowl of disappointing stew, while cold rain taps softly against your cloak. Tomorrow, the fields return, and your spine is already afraid. Chapter 3: Blacksmith, Heat and Smoke. Endless hammering, fire, and burns shape exhausting village industry. You wake before sunrise again, although wake feels slightly inaccurate because your arms never fully stopped hurting from yesterday. Every muscle between your shoulders complains immediately the moment you sit upright. Somewhere outside, rainwater drips steadily from rooftops, while distant hammering already echoes through the village darkness. Clang, clang, clang. The blacksmith has begun. Apparently medieval blacksmiths do not believe in sleeping. Cold air creeps through the cracks in your cottage walls, while weak firelight flickers beside piles of damp clothing drying very unsuccessfully near the hearth. You pull stiff boots onto swollen feet and immediately regret existing. Outside, the sky remains dark blue with the first pale hints of dawn barely visible beyond drifting smoke. Today you work at the forge, which sounds dramatic and impressive until you remember it mostly involves heat, smoke, burns, and endless hammering powerful enough to rearrange your skeleton permanently. Breakfast appears beside you in the form of coarse bread, weak ale, and onions. Medieval workers consume onions with the emotional dedication of people trapped in a long, unhealthy relationship. You eat quickly while smoke from the hearth stings your eyes. A quirky historical detail historians often mention is that blacksmiths occupied strangely respected positions inside many medieval villages. Skilled metalworkers created tools, nails, horseshoes, locks, knives, farming equipment, and weapons essential for survival. Villagers depended heavily on blacksmiths, while simultaneously remaining slightly intimidated by men who spent entire days surrounded by sparks, fire, and heavy iron hammers. Honestly, that intimidation feels reasonable. Outside, muddy roads already fill with movement despite the early hour. Farmers lead oxen toward the fields, while merchants prepare carts beside smoking cottages. But above every ordinary village, sound rises the forge itself. Clang, clang, clang. You follow the noise toward a low wooden workshop near the edge of the village. Smoke pours constantly from the chimney, while orange firelight flickers through open shutters. Even from outside, heat radiates through the cold morning air strongly enough to feel unnatural. Inside, the forge resembles a place designed specifically to punish human lungs. Smoke hangs thick beneath blackened rafters, while sparks burst through dim air like furious fireflies. Iron tools cover every wall. Horseshoes cool beside buckets of water. Chains hang from wooden beams overhead. The furnace glows bright orange near the center of the workshop, while several workers already move through the heat drenched in sweat despite the freezing weather outside. The blacksmith himself barely acknowledges your arrival. He simply points toward a pile of iron rods, with the exhausted confidence of a man who has accepted endless labor as a permanent spiritual condition. A mainstream historical fact often forgotten is how physically dangerous blacksmithing truly was before modern industrial safety. Burns, eye injuries, smoke inhalation, crushed fingers, and repetitive strain injuries likely affected many metalworkers constantly. Medieval industry relied heavily on human endurance rather than protective equipment, which becomes extremely obvious within minutes. You begin operating the bellows beside the furnace. The task sounds simple. It is not simple. The massive leather bellows resist every movement while heat blasts against your face hard enough to dry your throat instantly. Each pull sends air roaring into the furnace until flames leap violently upward around glowing iron bars. Sweat begins pouring down your neck almost immediately. Outside, it is freezing. Inside the forge, it feels like somebody trapped summer inside a wooden building and gave it anger issues. Nearby, another worker hammers glowing iron against an anvil with terrifying rhythm. Clang, clang, clang. The noise fills the workshop non-stop. Conversation becomes nearly impossible over the crashing metal. Sparks burst across the floor while smoke curls around the rafters overhead. One worker coughs constantly into his sleeve without slowing down even slightly. You suspect medieval villages collectively suffered hearing damage simply from standing near blacksmiths too often. The blacksmith removes a glowing horseshoe from the furnace using long iron tongs. The metal burns bright orange against the dim, smoky workshop. He slams it onto the anvil and begins hammering immediately while steam rises from sweat dripping onto hot iron. The speed feels unnatural. Hammer strikes land with brutal precision, while sparks explode across the floorboards. Nearby workers barely react anymore even when glowing fragments bounce against boots and clothing. This is apparently normal workplace behavior now. You help carry finished tools toward a storage rack along the wall. The iron feels heavier than expected. That becomes another hidden reality of medieval labor. Everything weighs more than modern people emotionally prepare for. Iron hammers, buckets of nails, horseshoes, chains, even the aprons somehow feel exhausting. A strange historical detail scholars sometimes mention is that medieval blacksmiths occasionally gained reputations bordering on mystical. Villagers associated metalworking with secret knowledge because transforming raw ore into useful tools looked almost magical compared to ordinary farming labor. Some folk traditions even linked smiths with supernatural luck, strength, or dangerous tempers. Standing here now, however, the blacksmith mostly looks like a very sweaty man, one minor inconvenience away from attacking the furnace personally. By midday, the workshop air becomes nearly unbearable. Smoke clings to your hair and clothing, your hands ache from lifting iron repeatedly, while your arms vibrate faintly after hours beside the hammering. Every surface feels hot, dusty, or both simultaneously. Workers pause briefly for food near the forge entrance, where cooler air drifts through the open doorway. Bread, onions, weak ale, and salted meat pass between soot-covered hands, while everyone sits silently on rough benches. Nobody has enough remaining energy for meaningful conversation. One younger apprentice accidentally brushes his wrist against hot iron and yelps loudly before plunging his arm into a nearby water bucket. Nobody panics. Several workers glance briefly toward him, then continue eating. Burns clearly happen often enough to qualify as background scenery. Scholars still argue whether medieval craftsmen enjoyed significantly better living conditions than ordinary peasants, because skilled trades sometimes earned higher incomes and greater social respect. However, surviving evidence also suggests many craftsmen endured exhausting hours, unstable demand, and physically destructive working conditions despite their valuable skills. At the moment, your own professional opinion centers around wanting fresh air before your lungs become smoked meat. Unfortunately, the afternoon somehow grows hotter. More villagers arrive requesting repairs. A farmer needs broken plow parts fixed. Another customer brings damaged horseshoes. A merchant complains about cracked cart fittings, while the blacksmith responds with the emotional warmth of an irritated volcano. The hammering never stops. Clang, clang, clang. Hours pass beneath endless sparks and furnace heat, while daylight slowly fades outside the workshop windows. Your shoulders burn now, your palms sting from rough iron tools, smoke scratches the back of your throat each time you breathe, and still the forge continues roaring beside you. As evening approaches, rain begins falling outside again. Cold wind slips briefly through the open doorway each time customers enter, creating strange waves of steam where rainwater touches hot metal near the furnace. Honestly, the entire workshop feels one mistake away from becoming a historical tragedy. At last, near sunset, the blacksmith finally lowers his hammer. The silence feels shocking. Your ears continue ringing anyway. Workers slowly clean the forge, while embers glow softly beneath darkening rafters. Tools return to hooks along the walls. Water buckets sit clouded with ash beside the cooling furnace. Smoke drifts lazily upward, while outside the village disappears beneath cold evening fog. You step back onto the muddy road feeling strangely hollow from exhaustion. Your clothing smells permanently burned now. Your hands ache, your head pounds from hammering, and somewhere behind you the blacksmith has already started preparing tomorrow's iron. Because medieval labor never truly ends, it only pauses long enough for your body to become afraid again. Chapter 4. Carrying water. Forever. Ordinary survival depends on constant hauling, lifting, and walking. You wake to the sound of water splashing somewhere outside your cottage, which immediately feels threatening because medieval villages rarely produce cheerful water-related surprises. Rain taps softly against the roof, while cold gray light creeps through cracks in the wooden walls. Your shoulders already ache before you even move. Unfortunately, today involves carrying water, which means by sunset your spine will personally file complaints against civilization itself. The fire beside the hearth has nearly died overnight. Thin smoke drifts lazily upward, while damp air settles across the tiny room with the emotional warmth of a wet sock. You sit upright slowly, every muscle protesting yesterday's labor. Sleep, once again, has accomplished almost nothing, except briefly interrupt your suffering. Outside, the village still hides beneath pale morning fog. Mud covers everything. Chickens wander between puddles, while distant carts creak along narrow roads. Somewhere nearby, a baby cries. Somewhere else, a dog barks at absolutely nothing. Medieval villages contain constant background noise, created entirely by exhausted humans and emotionally unstable animals. Breakfast arrives in a rough wooden bowl. Thin porridge, dark bread, weak ale, again. You stare at the meal for one long moment, silently wondering whether medieval people invented seasoning and simply chose violence instead. Still, you eat quickly because carrying water burns energy fast. A mainstream historical fact, often forgotten, is that before plumbing systems, ordinary households required enormous daily amounts of manual water transport. Water for cooking, water for washing, water for brewing ale, water for cleaning tools, water for animals, water for gardens. Every drop traveled through somebody's aching arms first, and today, unfortunately, those arms are yours. You step outside carrying 2 wooden buckets attached to a shoulder yoke, polished smooth from years of human misery. The wood digs immediately into sore muscles across your back. Wonderful. Your day has barely started, and already your skeleton feels emotionally attacked. A narrow, muddy road winds downhill toward the village well near the center of town. Other workers move silently through the fog, carrying buckets, barrels, and clay jugs. Nobody speaks much this early, mostly because everyone understands the terrible truth awaiting them at the well. More lifting, more walking, more mud. A quirky historical detail historians sometimes mention is that medieval wells often became crowded social spaces where villagers exchanged gossip, arguments, news, and occasional public humiliation. Entire communities depended on shared water access, meaning your daily hydration routine also doubled as unavoidable neighborhood interaction. Honestly, that sounds exhausting even without the buckets. The village well appears slowly through the mist ahead, a circular stone structure surrounded by muddy footprints, scattered barrels, and several already irritated villagers waiting their turn. One woman argues loudly with a man over spilled water, while another struggles to stop a goat from drinking directly out of a wooden pail. Medieval life contains very few organized systems. You join the line beside the well, while cold wind slips beneath your cloak. Nearby, a worker lowers a heavy bucket into darkness using thick rope wrapped around a wooden crank. The rope groans loudly while water echoes faintly below. Then comes the difficult part, pulling it back up. The bucket emerges dripping and heavy enough to suggest medieval wells connect directly to the bottom of the ocean. Water sloshes over the sides, while the worker strains visibly against the rope. No machines help here, no convenient pumps. Just human muscles slowly losing arguments with gravity. Eventually, your turn arrives. You grip the rough crank handle and begin hauling. Your arms burn almost immediately. Wet rope scrapes against your hands, while cold droplets splash across your boots. The bucket rises inch by inch from darkness below until finally heavy water spills over the stone edge. You immediately understand why medieval people developed strong opinions about wells. The buckets attached to your shoulder yoke fill quickly now, too quickly. Water always weighs more than expected. Scholars still argue whether medieval laborers developed different physical endurance thresholds compared to modern humans, because repetitive survival tasks began during childhood for most villagers. Many people likely spent decades hauling water daily before old age arrived carrying its own collection of horrifying surprises. At the moment, your own horrifying surprise is realizing you now must carry these buckets uphill. You lift the yoke carefully onto your shoulders. Pain arrives instantly. Water sloshes beside your legs, while the wooden beam presses hard across sore muscles. Every step through the mud requires concentration, because one bad slip could spill everything and emotionally destroy your remaining will to live. Ahead, the road climbs slowly between cottages and animal pens. Smoke drifts upward from rooftops, while villagers move through morning chores beneath gray skies. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith begins hammering again. Clang, clang, clang. Apparently that man plans to outlive silence itself. You continue uphill slowly. Your shoulders ache. Your hands sting from the rope. Water splashes against your boots with every uneven step. A child rushes past carrying smaller buckets, while an older woman balances clay jugs, with terrifying confidence developed through years of unavoidable practice. The strange historical reality many people overlook is how much medieval labor depended on balance and coordination, rather than pure strength alone. Carrying water efficiently required posture, rhythm, endurance, and constant awareness of slippery ground. One accident wasted enormous effort, which becomes relevant moments later. A man ahead loses his footing in deep mud. One bucket flips instantly. Water explodes across the road. Silence follows. Not dramatic silence, just the exhausted emotional silence of someone realizing they must now walk all the way back to the well and repeat everything again. Honestly, you feel this tragedy spiritually. By midday, your shoulders burn continuously. Red marks press deep across your skin from the wooden yoke, while your hands tremble faintly after hours of lifting and carrying, and still more water is needed. Always more water. Workers haul barrels toward kitchens. Stable boys drag sloshing buckets toward horses. Brewers transport enormous wooden casks, while washerwomen kneel beside streams, scrubbing clothing in freezing water cold enough to frighten fish themselves. Nobody rests for long, because medieval survival functions like a machine, permanently demanding additional labor. Around noon, you pause briefly beside the village stream, where several women wash clothing against flat stones near the riverbank. Wet fabric hangs from branches, while cold mist drifts over the water beneath pale sunlight. You sit carefully on a fallen log while someone passes around bread and onions. Again, onions. At this point, medieval society appears emotionally dependent on onions. Nearby, one exhausted worker removes the shoulder yoke and quietly massages swollen muscles across his neck. Deep red grooves mark his skin where wood pressed for hours. Nobody reacts much. These injuries belong to ordinary life now. Scholars still argue whether medieval people perceived physical pain differently because constant labor normalized discomfort from childhood onward. Some historians believe religious beliefs helped communities tolerate suffering through ideas of duty, humility, and endurance. Others argue people simply adapted psychologically because survival left few alternatives. Right now, your own philosophy centers entirely around lying face first into the river and allowing nature to decide your future. Unfortunately, the afternoon continues. Clouds darken overhead, while cold drizzle begins falling across the village roads. Mud thickens instantly beneath hundreds of footsteps. Your buckets feel heavier now, your clothing grows damp, wind pushes rain sideways beneath your hood, while villagers continue hauling water anyway, because unfortunately, thirst refuses to pause for weather conditions. By evening, your entire body feels hollowed out from repetition. Lift, walk, pour, return, again, again, again. The village well still creaks behind you, while fading orange light glows faintly through drifting fog. Somewhere nearby, tired workers trudge home, carrying empty buckets beside smoking cottages and muddy pathways. You step slowly toward your own tiny home, while cold rain taps softly against the wooden yoke resting across your shoulders. Tomorrow, somebody will need water again, and your spine already knows it.